gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and today I'm going to be reviewing Mutants, the card game from Lucky Duck Games. In a game of Mutants, your main focus is going to be this dominance track up here. In a multiplayer game, multiple players will be vying to get the most victory points moving upwards on the track. But in a solo game, you're going to have a boss whose health is denoted on the victory point track, and you're just trying to knock it down to 0. For example, Singularity Wizard's health begins at 40. The middle of this board is also where a lot of key things in the game are going to be happening. Throughout the game, you are constantly going to be trying to get your piece up here into the Fury spot, and your enemies down here on the Dread parts of the track. In a solo game, if you can successfully do this to the boss, then every turn they're going to lose health based on the small number on the bottom right of the round tracker. And if you can have them on the ropes at the end of the round, then they take an even larger hit to their health. In both solo and multiplayer, the game will take place across 5 rounds. So in multiplayer, you have 5 rounds to get the most points. In solo, this is your timer to try to get the boss's health down to 0. Various cards in your deck will allow you to gain power. And one thing that's interesting is that once you hit the Fury track, power that you gain will push your opponent down. So there's constant flip-flopping, shifting of positions, and battling it out to be king of the hill. You'll also be working with your player setup. In solo, there's going to be a solo mode side of one of the player boards where you put your boss. So you put the boss's deck here, the boss's card here, and pay attention to any setup or special power instructions on that card. So we know that for Singularity Wizard, the basic opponent for solo, you just shuffle all of his cards to form the boss deck, and then put that deck in the boss area, and then he has no special powers. So play with him is very straightforward. Over here on your own board is where lots of magic is happening. Just like in multiplayer, you're going to start the game with 2 of each of the basic mutants. Just like in the multiplayer game, you're going to start with a deck of 12 basic mutants with 2 copies of each card. So you'll basically have 6 different mutants and 2 copies of each in your starting deck. And depending on how you play these cards, you'll get access to your advanced mutants at various points in the game. For each round, you are going to draw 6 cards from your deck, and those are the cards that you have to work with for the round. In multiplayer, your round ends when the last player has played their last card, but in solo, the round ends when you, the player, have played your last card, and then the boss will stop taking actions. So on your turn, the first thing you're always going to do is get extra VP, or in this case, knock points off the boss's life total if you crush the competition. So crushing the competition means that you're at the very top of the dominance track, and your opponent is in the dread spaces. If you're not crushing them, nothing happens. In step 2, you're going to move your active mutant to the left or right. So basically, as mutants come here into the active spot, you slide ones that you've played before to the left or the right, and then they finally leave the board and go into your discard pile. Which takes us into step 3. After you've checked for dominance and moved your active mutants, then you can take one action. So the first one is deploy. That's the one you're going to take pretty often. You will just choose a card to play. So let's say that I want to deploy a mutant, so I can just describe quickly how this will work. Let's say I'm going to play my zombie, because my zombie has both an entrance power and an exit power. So some cards won't do anything when you put them down, but this one, based on this symbol, is going to give you +2 power when you play it. So once he goes into the active mutant spot, then you will use his deployment power. If the zombie is not knocked down during combat, nothing happens to him, and he leaves the board naturally, then his board leaving power will be triggered, and it says you may freeze this mutant, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So not all cards will have both, but a lot of cards will have a power that you activate when you put them down into the active spot, and they'll also have a power that you activate when you remove them from play. On my next turn, if I wanted to deploy another mutant, I would choose to move my zombie to the left or to the right, and put a new mutant here in the active spot. However, these basic mutants aren't just good for fighting, they're also good for breeding, which is how you make better mutants. So I said that your deck begins with only basic mutant cards. However, you get to choose 12 different advanced mutants to put up here in your advanced mutant decks. You don't have access to them at the beginning of the game, but you do know what's in here when you start, either because you drafted them, which is what you do in the multiplayer rules, or because it's a solo game and you constructed a deck of mutants that you wanted. Part of the challenge in solo is putting together good combinations of mutants so that you have a better chance of taking out the boss. However, to breed mutants, you're going to have to spend cards from your hand, which can affect the tempo in the game. To breed mutants, instead of placing another mutant out on the board and activating its power, you're going to take 2 cards from your hand, and those 2 cards are going to need to match the genetic information on the mutant you want. So if I want Rakshasa up here, I'm going to need to spend Beast, who has that brown shape on the card. And I'm also going to have to discard my Warrior for his red symbol. So these will be discarded, but when you breed, you actually bring the advanced mutant down immediately into the active mutant slot. So I can have Rakshasa right away. However, I might not have all the genes that I want, or perhaps I don't want to lose tempo by being short a card for the round, because to breed you have to discard 2 cards. Instead, I might choose to incubate. And to incubate, you discard any 1 card from your hand. It doesn't matter what the genes are. You just discard a card, and then you can take any of the advanced mutants that are showing on the decks up here and put them in the incubator until the next round. So in the next round, they're going to go to the top of your deck, but you cannot use them right away. So it basically means there's a turn where nothing happens at all. So as you play, you have to decide, do I need to deploy a mutant and get something done right now? Should I breed and bring an advanced mutant down into my active mutant slot and play their power right away? Or should I incubate? Can I afford to sacrifice a card now and have nothing happen on my turn for greater returns on a future round? These choices, in addition to choosing which cards to play for which actions in which order, leads to a game that is very fast, but there are tons of decisions to make because you're constantly paying attention to different card powers, what do you need at the moment, and then what is my opponent up to? On the player side of things, the last thing I want to talk about is freezing. So I mentioned earlier that the zombie's leave ability is that you can freeze it. Freezing is something that's either going to happen because of card abilities or because you have cycled through your deck. Every time you would draw a hand of cards, but you can't draw that full hand and you have to reshuffle your discard pile, you need to freeze one of the cards that's in it. Freezing is interesting because it's a way of thinning your deck so you get to your better mutants more quickly. But the other thing that it does that's important is that it actually scores you some points. When you freeze a mutant, it's going to be worth the number of points in the top right-hand corner. So a zombie might only be worth 1 point, but if you're getting towards the end of the game and you think you can sacrifice a more powerful mutant like Rakshasa, then he's worth 3. So in a multiplayer game, this just adds to your victory point total at the end, but during the solo game, it's going to enable you to knock extra life off of the boss's life total. Meanwhile, your boss is actually pretty easy to operate. You just draw 1 card at a time. So in this case, the Singularity Wizard would have played Warped Spacetime. This card just is a defensive card. So nothing would happen to you at the moment that it's played. But if the card eventually shifts off of the board before you do anything about it, it can do a little bit of damage to you. The AI cards will also tell you which direction you should slide them, because just like you, their active mutants slide to the left or to the right with this arrow. So this arrow is pointing to the right. Therefore, the card will slide to the right. Overall, this makes for a very usable AI that is fun to play against because its turns are quick, it's really clear what's happening, and you can check the consequences of your opponent's actions and get right back to what you wanted to do. To play Mutant solo, there are 2 bosses in the base box. There are other solo bosses you can get from the expansions, but if you only have the base game, you're going to have the Singularity Wizard, and you're going to have Jack Ice, who is a very familiar looking werewolf. One thing I do want to point out about Jack Ice, if you've gotten this game to play solo, is that there is an error on the card. This is after each turn Jack switches form, so he changes from human to werewolf. This actually means each round. So I'm putting this in here to show off Jack Ice and also to give you a quick PSA. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a quick overview of Mutants. So now for some final thoughts. I'm just going to say up front that Mutants is a very quick, charming card game that I'm really glad that I found out about. I particularly like the King of the Hill mechanism that emerges from the Fury track, where you're trying so hard to get up into the Fury space and push your opponent down into the Dread spaces on the track. And then in other parts of the game, you're trying to crawl from the bottom all the way back up to the top. That constant push and pull, and the way that you can use your cards to manipulate that track is really fun and fast and enjoyable. And I ended up really liking that as a major part of the game. I also like that Mutants involve some light deck construction. Choosing which advanced mutants you want to have access to during the game makes a big difference against the different solo bosses, and also makes each game feel a bit different. It really changes up your strategy and gives you something new and exciting to do each time just from changing those mutants out, something I really appreciate. In the multiplayer version of the game, you draft instead of constructing a deck, and I actually think that that sounds really fun as well. I also just generally appreciate that Mutants seems to make a lot out of a little. The game is short, your deck is small, and yet there's a whole lot of fun stuff that you can do with tempo and with playing cards tactically against your opponent and with making smart decisions in the moment that make you feel like you really did something cool with what was in your deck. I really appreciate that blend of simplicity with choice and with excitement, and Mutants is definitely bringing that to the table. That said, Mutants is not a perfect game, especially not for solo. First, I want to note that if you're looking for very deep card combos or very complicated deck constructions, then Mutants is really not for you. This game is meant to be light and fast, and limited options in the deck construction lend themselves to that. I personally like the game that way, but I think if you're looking for a more intense deck construction experience, then you might want to look elsewhere. My only real complaint about the game is that it offers very limited options for solo play. I only have the base box, and there are only 2 solo bosses in there. What that means is that you're going to have a great time until you kind of feel like you've been playing the same bosses again and again and again. There are 3 more bosses that exist right now, but they are spread out across 2 different expansion boxes, each of which is $26. So I basically have to spend about $50 more to get 3 more solo bosses. And for me, that's not quite a great deal. And I actually do like the solo mode. I think it's a really nice solo setup. I like the bosses, and I like the way that the game has been tweaked to work for solo play. However, I'm not sure that there is actually enough solo material in the game to make it a must-buy. If you like to play your games both solo and multiplayer, then this one might be worth a look. But for just solo, it's mechanically awesome while not quite giving you enough meat on the bone. However, because the game is so mechanically nice and snappy, for the quality of the game, I'm still giving it a 7 out of 10 and a Dice Tower seal of approval. Happy gaming.